Hey y'all! I hope that everyone is doing well and that you and your families are staying safe during quarantine. The title of my paper is The Juvenile Injustice System: Why the Crime May Not Fit the Punishment and How to Fix that Disparity. During our tour of the East Baton Rouge Juvenile Detention Center, I was a little discouraged by some of the facts and figures that were presented to us and how crime tends to disproportionately affect low-income families and/or people of color. But I was inspired by the risk assessment inventory and its success that Mr. Darren Patton spoke to us about. So I thought I would use this opportunity to explore some other alternatives to juvenile detention. More specifically, I wanted to find out whether there were other diversion programs or inventories similar to the one used here that were being implemented in other parts of the country to prevent the prolonged involvement of the juvenile justice system in the lives of juveniles, a sort of warning or rehabilitative system, if you will, as opposed to an adjudicative or adversarial system. With that said, my presentation today has three different parts. First, I will provide a brief history of the juvenile justice system and its inception. I will then explain some of the detrimental consequences of juvenile detention and the need for diversion programs or alternatives to incarceration. Lastly, I will discuss some of the programs and alternatives that I have found and their effectiveness in rehabilitating minors and deterring them from reoffending. I would like to add a disclaimer now that my research is just the tip of the iceberg and is in no way an exhaustive list or discussion. Rather, the programs and alternatives that I will introduce in this presentation are just some that have been widely implemented and studied across the country. The history of juvenile detention centers. In the late 18th and early 19th century, since few other options existed, minors were indiscriminately confined in jails and penitentiaries with adults. In response, penal reformers Thomas Eddy and John Griscom created the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism to oppose the confinement of minors in adult jails and prisons and to urge the creation of other options for minors. Their work eventually led to the establishment of the New York House of Refuge in 1825, the first institution designed to house minors who were deemed delinquent or likely to become delinquent. Within 3 years of its opening, similar institutions opened in Boston and Philadelphia, and by the 1840s, approximately 25 more facilities were established throughout the country. However, these institutions, known as reform schools, training schools, or industrial schools, quickly faced the same issues that plagued adult jails and prisons: overcrowding, deteriorating conditions, and staff abuse. Social reformers then began advocating for a new type of institution that placed greater emphasis on education. Through this movement, the concept of alternative schools was born and became an integral part of the juvenile justice system. Today, alternative schools are essentially public schools with more structure. For example, students that attend these schools may sometimes be subject to court-ordered restrictions. The history of the juvenile justice system. Until the 19th century, criminal courts tried both minors and adults. But the educational reform movement in England that perceived minors to be different from adults and that they had not yet fully developed their moral and cognitive capacities propelled the movement for juvenile justice reform in America. By the middle of the 19th century, following the creation of houses of refuge, probation and out-of-home placements like foster care were introduced. And by 1899, in Cook County, Illinois, the first juvenile court was established. By 1925, a functioning juvenile court existed in every state except Maine and Wyoming. Founded on the legal doctrine Parens Patriae, the juvenile court assumed the right to intervene on behalf of minors deemed to be in need of help based on their life circumstances or their delinquent acts. At first, Court hearings were informal, and judges exercised broad discretion in each case, with the primary goal of the juvenile court being to provide rehabilitation and protective supervision for minors and to give each child individualized attention. However, by the 1950s and 60s, there was growing concern about the disparities in treatment that resulted from the absolute discretion of juvenile court judges. Consequently, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court made a series of decisions that formalized juvenile courts and introduced more due process protections, such as the right to counsel, the right to confront and cross-examine adverse witnesses, and the right to remain silent. In the late 1980s, juvenile crime appeared to be on the rise, so many states passed punitive laws including mandatory sentences and automatic transfers to adult court for certain crimes. This tough-on-crime trend continued to grow until the late 90s, when many states began questioning the efficacy of institutional confinement and attempted to reduce the number of minors committed to youth correctional institutions. Adult courts versus juvenile courts. As we've discussed in class, some juvenile cases are tried in juvenile courts, whereas others are tried in adult courts, which one is usually dependent upon various factors such as the minor's age, his or her criminal history, and the crime allegedly committed. In some jurisdictions, prosecutors have discretion to make that choice. In other jurisdictions, that choice is made indiscriminately by poorly written legislation. The fact that juvenile cases are tried in adult courts at all is harmful for a number of reasons, two of which are pertinent to my presentation today. First, the juvenile justice system likely has less experience in adjudicating minors. This means that adult courts are potentially less likely to take into consideration the mental, physical, and emotional immaturity of the minor, causing them to treat minors as adults and sentencing them as such. Second, cases in adult courts are matters of public record, as opposed to juvenile court cases, which are confidential. As a result, once a minor has been convicted and sentenced in adult court and serves his or her time, he or she may experience hardships upon release in terms of finishing or receiving his or her education, applying for and or maintaining a job, searching and or applying for housing, etc., all of which can create a cycle of recidivism. The structure of the juvenile justice system. As with most things, the juvenile adjudicative process varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Generally, though, it begins with an arrest, followed by an arraignment, a trial, and then a motion for expungement. As you can see here, however, there are opportunities at nearly every stage in this process for the minor to be considered for release to his or her parents' custody, as opposed to remaining detained. And as we've learned from Mr. Patton, returning the minor to his or her parents' custody seems to be a great solution, one that has significantly decreased the number of juvenile detainees within the detention center here in East Baton Rouge. Oftentimes, when a minor is deemed a delinquent, he or she is no longer seen as a child, but an offender, and sometimes an irredeemable one. But of any individual group, I think children are those most deserving of second chances for a whole host of reasons. Children are still growing in more ways than one. They are impressionable and therefore likely to be more receptive to rehabilitation and community outreach than adults. Children have no power whatsoever over the circumstances into which they are born. They cannot change who their parents are and whether their parents are still together, how much money their parents make, the neighborhood they live in, the school they attend, etc. And often, the crimes they commit are a reflection of those circumstances. Detention does more harm physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially than good and may not actually do any good at all. Diversion programs and other alternatives to detention lighten the caseload of both juvenile and adult courts and lift some of the burden on detention centers and other facilities that are likely underfunded and overcrowded. Lastly, diversion right now can potentially prevent recidivism in the future. Balanced and Restorative Justice, BARJ. The first type of alternative to incarceration that I will discuss is known as Balanced and Restorative Justice, or BARJ. Restorative justice focuses on the relationships between offenders, their victims, and their community in an attempt to repair the damage caused by the crime committed. There are three different forms or methods of restorative justice: victim-offender mediation, family or community group conferencing, and peacemaking or sentencing circles. Victim-offender mediation is exactly what it sounds like. The victim is given the opportunity to voluntarily face the offending minor in a controlled, secure environment with a mediator present. This method allows the minor to better understand the effects of his or her crime and to attempt to make amends with the victim. This method also allows the parties to work together to address the harm and determine how to rectify it. Community group conferencing is similar to victim-offender mediation, but it casts a wider net in that, in addition to the participation of the victim and the offending minor, it allows their families and other members of the community to also gather and discuss the crime and its effects on them and the community as a whole. This method adds the element of community support for both the victim and the minor that is not present in the victim-offender mediation setting. However, this method does not allow an opportunity for the families and members of the community to propose solutions to repair the harm. Lastly, peacemaking or sentencing circles are similar to community group conferencing, with the added element of allowing all of the parties involved, the victim, the offending minor, their families, and other members of the community, to contribute ideas as to how to redress the effects of the crime within the community. In the sentencing context, these circles can be used to determine an acceptable sentence for the offender. Like community group conferencing, this method bolsters a sense of community support for both the victim and the minor. Now you might be wondering, how effective is restorative justice as an alternative to detention? Data suggests that low-level juvenile offenders are less likely to reoffend if, rather than being detained or incarcerated, they are allowed to remain within their communities and are given access to community-based programs. In particular, a study in Illinois showed that only 1 in 50 juveniles who had completed a restorative justice program recidivated within 6 months, whereas for minors within 3 to 6 months after their release from traditional juvenile justice programs, the recidivism rate was approximately 30 to 40%. Given this data, it should be noted that there are some complicating factors that make it nearly impossible to accurately predict whether restorative justice programs result in an actual decline in recidivism. These factors include the degree of voluntariness of each individual minor and whether minors who are more willing to cooperate with and complete these programs possess natural qualities that make them less likely to reoffend. Other factors include reporting errors created by the difficulty of composing control groups, tracking individuals over a long period of time, and proving a link between the programs and observed outcomes. Nevertheless, it seems that one of the redeeming qualities of restorative justice programs is that they focus on contextualizing the crime for the minor by including the victim and other members of the community in the process in order to help the offender better understand the consequences of his or her actions. In fact, in comparisons of victims' experiences, data shows that victims who participated in restorative justice programs reported greater satisfaction than those who were involved in traditional juvenile justice programs. Yet another redeeming quality of restorative justice is that it is more cost efficient than incarceration. Family intervention. Given my concerns regarding the uncontrollable circumstances into which children are born, I was especially interested in finding out how to address the problem of juvenile criminality at what seems to be the root of the issue, the family. There is one particular alternative to incarceration that takes into account these familial ties and circumstances, and that is family intervention. Family intervention can take many forms, some of which include functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, and multidimensional treatment foster care. Functional family therapy, or FFT, focuses on altering family-based risk factors that are associated with delinquent behavior, including parental maltreatment, poor parental supervision, and inadequate family communication. It utilizes contingency contracts between parent and child to modify maladaptive and delinquent behavior. It is a relatively short-term program involving only 8 to 15 sessions that, when executed properly, can decrease felony recidivism rates by nearly 40%. In addition, a net benefit of over $10 is realized for every dollar spent on the program. Multisystemic therapy, or MST, focuses on changing how minors function in various settings associated with antisocial conduct, such as their home, school, peer, and neighborhood environments. Through this relatively short-term program of about 4 to 6 months, therapists are assigned 4 to 6 families. Each therapist then provides aid and other services in the minor's home and other settings to increase the chances that behavioral change will endure across all aspects of the minor's life. When properly implemented, MST can be both clinically and cost-effective. In a study with a 4-year follow-up period, the recidivism rate among serious juvenile offenders who completed MST was significantly lower at 22.1%, whereas the recidivism rate among those who completed individual therapy was 71.4%. In another follow-up study with the same groups, completed almost 14 years later, the MST group had 57% fewer arrests in comparison to the individual therapy group. In addition, a benefit to cost ratio of $28.33 is realized for every dollar spent on this program. Multidimensional treatment foster care, or MTFC, is similar to multisystemic therapy in that it also focuses on the influence of family and peer interactions and the minor's various environments on criminal behavior. However, unlike MST, MTFC involves working with foster parents and biological parents to facilitate the return of minors to their biological families. A comparison of minors assigned to complete MTFC and minors assigned to group homes found that those receiving MTFC were more likely to return to their families, subject to fewer criminal referrals, and experience less than half of the amount of contact with police and the court system. Conclusion. There are a variety of reasons why change is necessary in the current juvenile justice system. First, evidence shows that families with extensive contact with the justice system account for up to half of all cases within the system overall. This fact confirms a concern that I stated earlier in my presentation as to the uncontrollable nature and circumstances of the families into which minors are born. A new system that incorporates family-based programs to address the needs of these families could over time end their cycle of crime. Second, there is minimal evidence that the juvenile justice system reduces criminal behaviors beyond what would naturally occur through normal maturation of minors. In fact, there is data to show the opposite. Among youth who are released from residential corrections programs, 70 to 80% of them are rearrested within 2 or 3 years. This confirms multiple other points that I mentioned earlier, specifically that incarceration tends to do more long-term harm than short-term good, as well as the fact that children are likely to be more receptive to incarceration alternatives than adults. Consequently, it seems that diversion programs and other interventions are more likely than incarceration to prevent recidivism in the future. The programs and alternatives that I have discussed today are just some of the many that have seen success when properly executed. And while they seem fairly easy to implement, I think the general consensus of the public to punish wrongdoers as opposed to rehabilitate them makes it difficult to implement these programs across multiple systems and jurisdictions. Still, the goal of my research was to focus on the families of delinquent minors and call attention to the fact that they are most likely to suffer from poverty and have few resources to prevent delinquent behavior on their own. Simply put, the disparity between these family circumstances and the consequences of criminal behavior is a harsh one that deserves greater attention. I hope that this presentation has given y'all some hope that it is possible to make changes within our community, and that change starts with us. Thank you.